As European Union leaders debated behind closed doors for nearly 16 hours, a very different scene unfolded outside. Tractors rolled into Brussels, roads were blocked, tires burned, and potatoes flew through the air. Thousands of farmers flooded the streets, confronting police in a vivid display of public frustration. By late 2025, Europe, once confident in its unity and global influence, was showing clear signs of internal strain. At the center of the tension was the EU's attempt to strengthen financial support for Ukraine by leveraging frozen Russian assets. Since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war more than 3 years earlier, the EU has frozen approximately €210 billion belonging to Russia's central bank. The majority of these funds, around €185 billion, are held at Euroclear, a Belgium-based financial clearing institution. Initially, the EU limited itself to using only the interest generated by these assets, avoiding the politically and legally sensitive principle. But Ukraine's funding needs continued to grow, with estimates reaching hundreds of billions of euros for 2026 and 2027. Faced with this reality, European policymakers began exploring a more ambitious plan, using the frozen Russian assets themselves as collateral for a large loan. The proposal was bold. Ukraine would receive a massive interest-free loan backed by Russian assets. If Moscow refused to pay war reparations, Ukraine would not be required to repay the debt, and the frozen funds would be used instead. In the days leading up to the December 18th to 19th summit, senior EU officials expressed confidence that an agreement was within reach. Yet when negotiations stretched late into the night, cracks quickly emerged. Belgium took a firm stance against the plan. As the country hosting Euroclear, it faced the highest legal and financial exposure. Belgian leaders warned that seizing or directly using Russian assets could trigger legal retaliation from Moscow or prompt the confiscation of European assets inside Russia. Beyond legal risks, there was a broader concern. Such a move could undermine global confidence in the Eurozone as a safe destination for foreign reserves. Several other EU members, including Hungary, Slovakia, Italy, Malta, and Bulgaria, shared these concerns, even if they voiced them less forcefully. By the end of the talks, the original plan was abandoned. Instead, EU leaders agreed on a compromise, jointly borrowing from capital markets to provide Ukraine with a €90 billion loan over 2026 to 2027, backed by the EU budget rather than Russian assets. The announcement was framed as a success. European Council President Antonio Costa emphasized that the EU had followed through on its commitments, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed the decision as a sign of continued support. Still, beneath the official statements, the outcome revealed a deeper challenge. The EU had failed to reach consensus on a more assertive approach and instead turned inward to finance its goals. The reasons were clear. The financial risks were significant, and there was no agreement on how losses would be shared if legal challenges succeeded. At the same time, many national leaders were under growing pressure at home. Across Europe, voters were grappling with high inflation, elevated energy prices, and increasing tax burdens. While support for Ukraine remains strong in principle, public tolerance for open-ended financial risk is far more limited. Confiscating foreign assets, especially at the cost of potential escalation, proved a step too far for several governments. The strategic ambitions behind the plan also fell short. Some EU leaders hoped that using Russian assets would lock all member states into a single unified position and reduce the risk of Moscow negotiating separately with individual countries. The move was also seen as a way for Europe to assert greater strategic independence, particularly as U.S. military support for Ukraine declined. Instead, the failure highlighted internal divisions. Russia responded swiftly. At a press conference on December 19th, President Vladimir Putin condemned the idea of using Russian assets, warning that it would damage trust in Europe's financial system. He noted that many countries, especially major commodity producers, were watching closely, questioning whether their own reserves could one day face similar treatment. Putin also pointed to economic contrasts. While public debt in several EU countries exceeds 100% of GDP, Russia's remains comparatively low. Additional EU borrowing to support Ukraine would further strain national budgets. Any unpaid loans would ultimately fall on European taxpayers. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán openly criticized the agreement, calling the funds unrecoverable and reaffirming Hungary's decision to stay out. Meanwhile, the unrest outside Brussels continued to grow. Farmers from across Europe gathered to protest the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement with South American nations. They fear that lower-cost agricultural imports will undercut European producers, who already operate under strict environmental and animal welfare regulations. The demonstrations were dramatic, but reflected deeper concerns. Rising fertilizer costs, crop failures, disease outbreaks, and regulatory pressures have left many farmers feeling overlooked by policymakers. Similar frustrations have surfaced in France and other countries, where agricultural communities argue that national interests are being sacrificed for distant geopolitical goals. Taken together, these events expose a fundamental dilemma for the European Union. On one hand lies the ambition to remain a decisive global actor and to support Ukraine for as long as necessary. On the other stands the reality of slower growth, political fragmentation, and growing social discontent. The decision not to use frozen Russian assets was more than a technical adjustment. It was a moment that revealed the limits of EU cohesion, rather than projecting unity. Europe exposed how easily collective plans can be constrained by national risk and domestic pressure. Europe now faces difficult choices. The €90 billion loan may provide Ukraine with time, but its financial and political costs will be borne by European citizens already under strain. Frozen Russian assets remain in legal limbo, while hopes of reparations remain distant. Once confident in its shared direction, Europe is now navigating competing priorities at home and abroad, seeking stability, credibility, and unity in an increasingly complex world.